Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Gadfly live stream for today. My name is Carlos, and I am the producer of the Gadfly Multi-Channel Network. We work with some great contributors, Jim Willie, London Paul, Ken Shorten Jr. So if this is the first time hearing one of our live streams, we appreciate you tuning in. And then also just make sure you go to our site, which is the gadfly.vhx.tv, where you can find out about our subscription-based service. And then also we do have a couple of social media profiles, which is at the Gadfly MCN on Twitter, and then just the Gadfly on Facebook. And today I'm very excited to be joined by contributor London Paul of the SearsReport.com. Paul does extensive writing analysis of all things economics, geopolitics, technology, and you can find his hub spot at the SearsReport.com is his site. And then he also does a premium podcast subscription system. So, Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, very well. And yourself? How are you?
Doing great, Paul. Managing the year accordingly. And it's the year that I think that we all just have to be prepared to make a lot of pivots, a lot of changes as we adapt through the evolving things occurring right now.
Yeah, well, that's all any of us can do. I mean, we're constantly having to shift goalposts and how we do things, but the important thing is we just keep going and do what we can do as best we can, and eventually the chaos some of the chaos will end and more chaos will begin. We're in that sort of cycle where for the next however long it is, and I don't think it's months. I think by the time we get out the other end, I've said this before, you're talking a number of years, and then there's a whole bunch of new challenges that lie ahead for humanity for the next decade and longer, because you can't rebuild things overnight. It's impossible. So, and we've tried to make a point of this to manage people's expectations that there isn't a light switch moment where everything gets resolved and everyone can carry on with their lives. It's that fundamental pivotal shift, and what we try to discuss as best we can is some of those pivotal shifts, what's going on, and so people understand and can kind of have a better understanding and expectation of what's coming.
Yeah, and as difficult as it is to not necessarily focus, but get so consumed in the partisan U.S. politics, there's so much evolving currently, economically, geopolitically. But obviously, right now, Paul, I think a lot of the attention has to do with just the upcoming U.S. elections and how we're going to navigate through that. And wanted to see, go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, it's everybody knows that I've said for as long as I've been on the Gadfly and elsewhere, and I've talked about this for 20 odd years of my life, that partisan politics is an illusion. It's just divide and conquer a nation. It makes people feel it's some sort of bona fide democracy, and in the end, nothing changes. And of course, okay, when Trump was elected, there was big expectations of major changes, and of course, we haven't seen that. But lo and behold, time moves very quickly, and we're nearly at the sort of 4-year mark of Trump's presidency, obviously when he was elected, not when he was inaugurated. So, in less than 3 months, we have the presidential elections. Now, obviously, we don't get sort of bogged down in the he said, she said thing. But I think one aspect that did interest me was all this kind of idea of voting by mail and just to chew through what's been going on, because I think it's indicative of a potentially big problem that is coming in November, one way or the other. Now, of course, Trump's made it very clear that he has concerns about vote rigging via people sending, postal votes, about perceived fraud and rigged elections. And there is some validity in that, of course. I think equally part of it, for me, is he's a little bit concerned he's going to lose. And he even came out lately saying, well, if I lose the election, it's because it's rigged. And that's very inflammatory discourse to use at this point. I'm not saying he doesn't have validity in saying it, and I understand concerns. And of course, the fact that Trump's campaign and this Republican National Committee have actually tried to go to court and many, many times, and they've got some sort of war chest of $20 million or whatever to challenge voting rules. And they filed lawsuits in states such as Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. They're kind of so-called, I guess, key battle states. There's also been talk that he might produce, executive orders to curb mail-in voting. That could be from the Postal Service to not delivering certain ballots, to stop local officials from counting them after election day. I think that's pretty extreme. And again, you have to be a little bit careful that, I'm not taking sides here. I'm just stating facts. At the end of the day, I don't have any interest in the election. I mean, I'm not really a big fan of Trump, but I'm equally not a fan of Biden. And if you had to choose one or the other, I think it would be better Trump was elected than Biden. But that's not because I think either of them have any capability to govern the United States. But what I think is also interesting is that on the back of this, you've got Republicans have warned Trump basically that restricting mail-in ballots could actually be detrimental to his own election chances in November. Now, of course, his supporters think that Trump will win legitimately, and there's every reason to suggest he will. And therefore, the Democrats are trying to steal the election by manipulating any sort of postal balloting. So it's good optics for Trump. It resonates with his supporters and his supporter base, and it might make certain people who are hanging on the fence go, well, he has a point here. Now, it's of course there is an argument to do with the U.S. Postal Service. Can it handle this enormous amount of postal ballots? I mean, how many people are going to vote? I don't know. I don't have any understanding of the figures. I don't think anyone does. I mean, and then the risk is you're going to have a shortage of people in polling stations, and you're going to have all sorts of issues because what are they going to do regarding restrictions to do with the coronavirus? Are they still going to have ridiculous restrictions in place that make postal voting potentially a problem, but also voting in person? And the other issue is, of course, if they have extensive postal voting, the final result of the presidential election might not be known for days or even weeks. And what does that do? I mean, what does that do in terms of markets? What does that do in terms of general perception, and what is going to happen in those ensuing weeks? And to put this in context, I think recently there was a Democrat primary for a US House seat, and after 6 weeks, all the ballots have yet to be counted. I mean, this is kind of staggering that we have this situation. I mean, not that I'm a fan of any electoral system, but in the UK, it's all, I mean, okay, it's economies of scale, of course, because the US is far bigger, but just get more people to count them. But they do this overnight, and in some cases in a matter of hours. But why is it taking 6 weeks? And therefore, the longer it takes, the more the perception is that, voting can be manipulated. And of course, there's all this kind of toing and froing between, Trump making accusations on the one side, and then accusations, of course, being made on the other side. And Trump's kind of cherry picking where he's going, well, I'm okay with regards to Florida because, I've got, Republican governors there. They've managed elections professionally. Therefore, I don't have a problem with regards to that. And therefore, the question is, what is the outcome of this? How is it all going to be managed, and what is the risk of voter fraud, whatever side of the political fence you're on? And of course, voters, from what I understand, in most states can request an absentee ballot by mail without providing a reason. And numerous states are still reviewing their voting policies, and as we say, we're less than 3 months away from the election. And I think Colorado, Hawaii, Washington, and several others have already conducted elections entirely by mail and haven't had any problem. And I think there's 3 additional states, including California and Nevada, who plan to send ballots to registered voters because of the pandemic. But of course, the argument is that there's this kind of you can't even have a voting system without becoming partisan. So therefore, the argument is that the Democrats want to make voting by mail easier, and because then they think the votes can be manipulated, and Trump would then lose the election on the basis of vote rigging. And Republicans are actually fighting voting rule changes in, I think, 17 states, and they're going to go to court on about 40 occasions. I mean, the whole thing is completely, out of hand. I mean, just some examples. In Iowa, they sued to prevent third parties from filling out personal information on absentee ballot requests. I think there's some validity in that. In Minnesota, they wanted to prevent ballots from being sent to inactive voters. That's highly questionable. And in Nevada, they filed a lawsuit against the state over plans to send ballots to active registered voters. So, I mean, yes, I can understand concerns about vote rigging and the issue of tampering with ballots, but I think when you start to go down this route of suing and counter-suing, it makes a mockery of the entire voting system. And again, okay, people may say it doesn't matter, but the outside world's looking in going, well, here's the US who accuses other nations of rigging votes and tampering with election. And look at the debacle that's unfolding. And it's not just the Republicans. I mean, the Democrats have gone to court numerous times over voting rules, and they filed, I think, over 150 lawsuits. I mean, so I'll just stop there, CJ. So obviously you come in and give your viewpoint, and then I'll carry on with a few more points.
I think you nailed it, Paul, as you alluded to that. This is just another perfect example of just how dysfunctional the federal government is. It's just another example of many where time and time some of the things that we should be able to debate come to proper resolution, and yet here we have just the basic function of voting being politicized. Now, myself, in my personal opinion, I do not feel comfortable with dropping something, in the mail and just assuming that's going to be logged properly. In particular, with the U.S. mail here that we have, there are several times that I received stuff for my neighbors for the wrong address, the wrong zip code. Hence why the U.S. Postal Service, I know they've worked hard the past several years to be solvent, and which has included extending to Saturday deliveries, Sunday deliveries, all these things in the form of being efficient. But I would rather personally, which, for the most part, if you think of going to a place of voting and standing in line, if you're standing, distant from each other appropriately, and obviously when you go into the voting booth, it's completely, isolated. There's no one else there. And so if you have those safety protocols in place, and, it's just a shame, Paul. I think it's just a perfect example of just, how broken our political process is. And I laughed the other day when we had the resignation of the entire government. Was it Lebanon? The entire government resigned?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah,
when the entire government resigned, saying, hey, you know what? We're a bunch of failures. We failed you. And they resigned. I'm like, when's the United States federal government going to do the same thing? When you look at the trillions, you look at the trillions of dollars in debt, you look at the mismanagement of trust to the American people, so many reasons where you could easily make the argument that perhaps it's time that the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, they all do the same thing. Let's completely reboot the system. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, yeah, but that's essentially what absolutely needs to happen. And there is a lot of validity in saying there are concerns about, postal ballots, and it works on all sides of the equation. And I mean, I understand Trump's perspective, but I can understand, or both sides of the equation, even though the political system's illusionary. Because the question is, how do they may make the wrong determination about who receives a ballot? Ballots, like you just said, CJ, could be sent to the wrong address or lost in the mail. Voters may have their ballots, thrown out because apparently they didn't do something quite right, or maybe a signature's incorrect on it, or the name doesn't exactly match the name on file with election officials. And to have apparently a first world nation that experiences these problems. I mean, let's be honest, back in March, when all this pandemic sort of kicked off, you would have thought they'd have been going, hang on, we have an election in November. What happens if this spirals out of control, or what happens if it means that, voting in person suddenly becomes an issue, whether it's a personal issue or a logistical issue? And it appears, what is it, 9 weeks, 10 weeks out roughly from the election, people, are sat there going, well, we're not sure of the procedure. We're not happy with regards to how it's going to be rolled out. Oh, and by the way, we're going to sue any, states if we don't feel they comply, or if it's a sort of a state where, these kind of certain states is like the UK, where they really determine the outcome of elections. And therefore, they seem to have added gravitas as to concerns about it. And of course, okay, Trump sometimes just throws comments out, but he made this comment about, well, maybe we should postpone the election. Um, and of course, there was backlash from his own side saying, well, hang on a minute, you can't do that. And only Congress has the mandate to change the election. And frankly, I will be very surprised if they cancel the election and moved it back, to another day. But the trouble is, as well, is Trump sometimes needs to think and not speak, because talking about bringing out executive orders that might curb voting by mail only arouses suspicion in people that he wants to hide voting by mail because he wants to restrict the number of people who vote, because he thinks that might enhance his chances to win. And I'm not saying that's correct, but that becomes, a perception from people. Well, is Trump?
Sorry about that, Paul. Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. No. I mean, and of course, the argument then is, there's been suggestion, Trump could try to stop local officials from counting ballots after the election day, and try to tell the Postal Service not to deliver certain ballots to voters using all manner of emergency declarations. Of course, the president can't order the Postmaster General to do anything of the sort. There is no authority, and just merely talking about this, it's inflammatory. I mean, can't we just have a situation in a nation like the United States where everyone can just agree to have an election, and then let's see what the outcome is? But I'm no fan of politics. I'm no fan of partisan politics, and it's very divisive. But the world looks at this and goes, "What are you doing?" I mean, and in a way, it just contributes to people having, or nations looking at the US going, you're no longer a world leader. Your whole nation is falling apart. It just creates more a lack of confidence and a belief in the US in terms of, you can't do things domestically. How can you do things, internationally? And it's just contributing to the demise of the US in the eyes of the world, which is obviously extremely damaging in the short term and the long term. And yes, there is all manner of avenues open, but the fact either side is looking at this going, well, okay, what could we do here? Is there any amendment that we can cite to influence the outcome of postal votes? I mean, one thing was Trump. There has been some suggestion that Trump could send federal officials into states under the guise of ensuring every vote is counted, citing the 15th Amendment or the Voting Rights Act. I mean, when you're starting to spend multi-million dollars of taxpayers' money to try and devise ways to implement what you want to see implemented, is just ridiculous. And again, it's we've never seen an election mired in this kind of nonsense before. But the feeling is, whatever the outcome of the election, there's going to be a percentage of people who vote Democrat or Republican who are simply going to refuse to accept the outcome, because the Trump supporters will go, it's impossible that Biden won, and Biden supporters will go, well, it's been rigged, and therefore, what is the outcome of this? Do we risk civil unrest, or could this potentially spiral out of control? And if Trump loses, what's the outcome in that regard? Because I mean, I'm not saying this is the case, but I've heard from a few people there is concerns that Trump will simply refuse to leave the White House, even if he loses. And I'm not saying that is an outcome, but there is all sorts of permutations here, and ultimately the outcome is going to be extremely damaging to the American people. And whether you agree with the political system or not, and I mean, and yes, no vote rigging should happen, but there comes a point where whatever the outcome, it's going to upset someone. I mean, the day used to be, well, we lost the election. Okay, we're not in for 4 years. We have to take accept the consequences of this. And then we have to be as best as possible, an opposition who challenges governments, as it should be, and of course rarely is, and do the best we can in opposition to try and implement policies that will be beneficial to the American people. Now, no, of course, that's pie in the sky talk.
Well,
But we are so far removed from that politically. And, the US has sadly become a horrendous example of the utter failure of a political system. Now, some may argue, okay, ultimately that's a good thing because it's only until the entire political system, economic system, financial system collapses will people then realize that there is a major problem and something needs to be done to address it.
yeah, absolutely, Paul. And I think in terms of the I think they said the same thing about like Obama, that Obama wasn't going to leave. Now, the bottom line is I highly doubt that the election results will be determined the night of the election. And one could argue, and I'm not the only one commenting on this and stating this, is that fundamentally, I don't think a whole lot is going to change, regardless of who's in office. Now, some of you are going to say that's absolutely insane. What in the world are you thinking about? But if you take a look at some of the policies, whether it's the spending, right, where at one time, the conservative base used to be mindful of spending, but you can throw that one out. Let's take a look at the foreign policy interventions that now it resonates with both parties. At one time, the Democratic Party used to be the anti-war party, and now they're filled with more neocons and people that are advocating for war and aggression and expansion of the so-called U.S. empire, all those things. So now where you're going to see a difference is just the way that people model things in regards to equality, social justice. That's where you would see a significant difference. But outside of spending and everything else like that, I think Trump has pretty much gave the Democrats everything that they wanted up to this point.
Well, you make an extremely valid point where even if the political system was essentially illusionary, there were some differences. And the UK is a great example of this, where, of course, we had the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and they were politically, at least, or ideologically quite different. And then when Tony Blair was elected in 1997, there was no difference. Everything just got blurred. Pardon the pun, or the sort of pun, but it was very hard to differentiate political parties from that point. And of course, fast forward to today, and then of course we had the election last December, which Johnson won, and obviously Corbyn was not in the same mold. He was very different. Of course, Corbyn's no longer there, and now they've got Keir Starmer, who really is just again blurred the difference. There's no tangible difference in reality between political parties, and that was the biggest giveaway, that they weren't even trying to hide anymore, that there was there was a real democracy, and you had the opportunity to vote for parties with different policies. And the point you make with regards to the US is very true. I mean, yeah, there might be some tinkering at the margins with regards to maybe Iran and what happens with regards to the JCPOA, for example, or maybe if Biden was elected, is he going to go more hardline against the Russians and less hardline against the Chinese? I mean, we don't know, but anyway, you make an extremely valid point with regards to this blurring of political differences, and still people become very partisan and tribal about who they vote for. I think one of the point worth making was to do with the postal service, because the Postmaster General, I don't know whether it's Louis, or we call it Louis, you may call it Louis DeJoy. He has come out and said that changes that were supposed to be made to the Postal Service, thank goodness, are going to be suspended till after the election. Because, I mean, frankly, the thing's in chaos as it is. But I know, let's implement more changes prior to an election. I mean, and there again, we had, I think, 20 Democrat states were going to file federal lawsuits. I mean, and some of the decisions they deferred means retail hours at postal offices aren't going to change, mail processing equipment, and you'll know what blue collection boxes are. I don't know what they are. They're going to stay in place. And no mail processing facilities will be closed. I mean, can you imagine going, well, let's just close a whole bunch of mail processing facilities whilst we're deluged with, I don't know, however tens of millions of postal votes. And thank goodness that has come about, because that would have just caused utter chaos.
Well, and again, if you take a look at some of the policies that have been impacted, I mean, there for a while, the United States government subsidized a lot of Amazon things, right? And
Yes.
allowed Amazon to become, but yet we didn't take a look at revamping anything with the U.S. Postal Service. Now there has been a lot of changes in terms of, different hours, and there was conspiracies that they're taking out mailboxes at these areas and urban areas, and they're taking mailboxes on purpose. They always evaluate that. I've seen many mailboxes that at one time it served a purpose, but mail collection is so low. So move the mailboxes, and now there's conspiracies that they're removing them strategically through cities. So I think at the end of the day, Paul, people get so emotionally charged, regarding with some of these subject matters, and it's unfortunate. Like at the federal level, we look at it and we're struggling to identify who the adults in the room are.
Yeah, and the problem is, you've got this Postmaster General, this DeJoy, who's had to come out and said, look, we have authority to implement changes to the postal system, and we're doing everything by the book, but and they're meant to improve because the postal services, unsurprising like everything else, has got serious financial difficulties. And this argument that they're making changes because Trump's told them to do it is just absolutely ridiculous. But they had all these lawsuits filed in 20 states, and of course, again, it's politicizing it. So they'll go, oh, they're making all these changes to the postal service because it's going to slow the mailing system down, and therefore it's going to impact the integrity of the election. Again, it's just everything has become politicized. Nothing can ever happen in the US anymore without it being politicized. And there is no doubt the US Postal Service, rather like the UK one, needs constantly refining and changing. I mean, the Postal Service here is not anything like it used to be, years ago, because of course the advent of email scrapped a lot of the Postal Service's function, just as one small example. And of course, people use couriers now, which of course private courier firm, which they, in the UK, which they didn't really, well, they existed, but people didn't bother using them now. But again, it's bringing the whole of the US political system, the US sort of into total disrepute, and it's really ultimately everyone's getting sucked into it and choosing sides, but they don't realize the damage that it's doing to the nation. And the problem is, because it's become so polarized, whatever the outcome of this election, and depending on how everything else unfolds economically and financially, and that there are going to be consequences. And because people are so polarized, that the risk is no one is going to accept the result if you lose. And that system, that just can't happen, because the consequences of that could be pretty severe. And I fear that could be a likely outcome, whether Biden wins or Trump wins. The opposition, for whatever reason, are going to challenge it. And what are they going to do? Keep raising legal challenges against results and demanding recounts and making all kind of accusations. And meanwhile, what happens to the U.S. government? I mean, what happens to their political system, as flawed as it all is? You have to have, I mean, as flawed as it is, you need to have some sort of political system. And everyone's going to be sat there arguing and disagreeing and making claims and counterclaims. And the only winners will be the court system. Mind you, they'll probably be drowned in lawsuits and people contesting everything. And in the end, the American people suffer as a consequence, because they just sat there watching this circus unfold. And what we've just discussed, I think, was worthy of discussion because of that very fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, let's switch gear a little bit. Let's talk about the national and almost global inclination in regards to vaccine manufacturing and that type. I think that's a good subject, especially as it relates to Russia and its development of what they're planning on. I'll let you start the conversation. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, look, we discussed this briefly with Ken. There's some new angles that I think are worth discussing, and I made my position very clear. I have, on a personal level, no intention of having any coronavirus vaccines. Now, my reasoning for it could be or probably very different to other people. I know there's all manner of people who have all manner of thoughts and ideas about why they don't want vaccines. And I'm not here to tell people what to believe. That's your own personal opinion. I think with things like this, it's a personal opinion. What I would say with regards to Russia briefly is now people will say, well, Russia seems to have cut corners. And there may be an argument that that's correct. But the one thing Putin is not going to do, he's not going to put his nation at risk of a vaccine that could have catastrophic consequences for his people. And, you know, also in a broader context, because I think there's already 20 nations signed up to having a Russian vaccine, they're not going to risk exporting it and having the same problem. Now, obviously, the question is, how could they have developed a vaccine so quickly? And there is no conspiracy theory that they were developing them, because that's the logical conclusion some people reach. Oh, well, they must have been developing this vaccine years ago. That proves there's a conspiracy. No, it doesn't. Russia's medical healthcare system is massively in advance of Western understanding. They have treatments for people that we don't have in the West, but we're not here to get into that. What I thought was interesting, and I wanted to sort of highlight this, is what is happening with regards to vaccine development in the UK. Because at the moment, effectively, there's all these groups all around the world working on vaccines apart from Russia now. With regards to what might win out in Europe, there's two groups. One's in Oxford University and there's one in Mainz, which is in Germany. And they seem to be kind of all regarded as being the two principal sort of or likely candidates that a vaccine will come out from. Now, there are 6 in total. So, of course, what they always do, you'll have a whole flood of different groups of people working on vaccines. And because there's no guarantee, of course, any vaccine will actually work. Now, they're saying, okay, we've had these encouraging results from 3 of these 6, and with these Oxford and German teams are the most advanced. Now, the Oxford vaccines had a lot of publicity, but the German one, which is, I think it's BioNTech, has attracted not as many headlines, but the argument has been that unlike the Oxford vaccine, that needs a conventional manufacturing process. The German vaccine's what's called mRNA-based product, and then if it's proven to work, they can be synthesized in labs at a far greater pace. So that may be advantageous. Now, they've both apparently had successful phase 1 and 2 trials, and then supposed to have phase 3 trials in which hundreds of thousands of people in multiple locations are going to be vaccinated. They say, okay, to demonstrate the safety and scalability. But let's just put some things, because I know a lot of people are very fearful of vaccines, and I understand perfectly why. And I'm not saying I don't have concerns about them also. But what I would want to put in context is there are risks in lots of things. If you have a general anesthetic for surgery, there is a risk that you may, die under anesthetic. And equally, there may be risks associated with vaccines. I think for me, the problem with vaccine, we've gone from having concerns about vaccines for what I feel are legitimate reasons to all manner of conspiracy theories about how they're going to vaccinate us and mess with our DNA, and how they're going to vaccinate us, and years later it'll start killing people, and all these statements. And there's not a shred of evidence to support that. That is sensationalism. It's dangerous. And it detracts again from the fact that people who are working with legitimate concerns about vaccines, and in the process, it damages their ability to affect change. What is worth discussing with regards to phase 3 trials is, more often than not, that around 30 to 40% are never successful anyway. Some don't work at all. Some may protect in some respect against coronavirus symptoms, but not prevent the transmission of the virus. Now, the question is, with regards to published information from these 2 vaccines, the thing that's very clear from what they're doing is there's no indication how long any protective effect could last. Could it last weeks, months, years? Nobody seems to know. Early trials have also focused on healthy people in the age range of 18 to 55. Therefore, the question is, what's going to happen in vulnerable groups? What about older people? Will it trigger an immune response in people? And therefore, these things that I think indicate concern. I mean, what's the point in having trials in an age group of 18 to 55 when most of those people will be perfectly healthy anyway and are not going to be affected, as it seems to be the case with regards to the coronavirus? Now, yes, they've said, okay, we've done these trials and patients are showing a response, but not usually after 2 doses, not 1. So they're saying is, well, we need 2 doses. And then they're also coming out in with regards to the UK one saying, well, it could likely to prevent severe disease rather than protect entirely. What does that actually mean? They don't know how long protection will last. Obviously, what's the benefits to people over 55 who, arguably is in the most risk group? And of course, they're going to have to conventional manufacturing. That's going to take an awful long time. What I think with regards to the UK one, the sponsors are this US Operation Warp Speed, the UK Ministry of Health, and the University of Oxford. Now, with regards to the German one, as I said, it's this mRNA. Now, therefore, that is arguably seen to be able to be processed a lot quicker. Now, again, of course, they've done these trials. Again, they're saying it needs 2 doses. The full effectiveness of antibodies remains unclear. They said it can cause flu-like symptoms in some people, but let's not go down the route that proves coronavirus is the flu, because it doesn't. And again, they don't know how long protection will last. They don't know if over 55s will benefit. And yeah, they're doing these extensive trials all around the world. They've got them in US, Germany, I think Argentina, Brazil. And again, the sponsors they've got European Investment Bank. Manufacturing partners are is obviously Pfizer and the Chinese drug manufacturer Fosun. I think the one in the UK, the partners AstraZeneca. Now, what we can say first off with regards to this, because a lot of people are extremely upset with all the comments Gates is coming out with. Well, in this example, there doesn't seem to be any indication of any involvement in Gates in any part of this process. But what I think we're seeing already is, from my perspective, and why, apart from my own reservations and why I don't want a vaccine, is I don't see how this is going to help vulnerable groups with any degree of certainty, and at what point do you introduce those into trials. And if you don't know how long the vaccine or the efficiency of it will last, what is it, weeks, months? What are people supposed to do? Spend the rest of their life being vaccinated? I don't think, for me, there's anything greatly encouraging in these studies. And the question comes back, in the UK in the last 8 weeks, if you look at the number of deaths in England and Wales, and you go back over a 5-year period, the deaths are no higher. So deaths rates have dropped markedly. There doesn't seem to be any indication that the virus is contributing at all in any way, shape, or form to the number of deaths, and that's a 5-year average, by the way. So my question is, and I've always said this, there comes a point where, why are we doing this anymore? Why are we, putting all these restrictions in place, causing economic carnage, causing huge amounts of unnecessary fear in people? And no, I don't support all the conspiracies about this. I'm absolutely adamant from my perspective, and people are welcome to disagree, that they simply are crassly incompetent and don't know what they're doing. And in fact, they can look at Sweden as a model. How many European nations or world nations are talking to the Swedes going, okay, you're Sweden, you're not the United Kingdom, you're not the United States, but what have you done? What can we learn from you? Can we apply some of the things you're doing? Are we seeing that? No. And I think the problem is that at the end of the day, I don't see at this point any really clear evidence how these vaccines will benefit people. Now, I'm not saying they won't, and there are certainly going to be people who want to be vaccinated, but there's too many uncertainties, and the most at-risk groups, if you don't do trials on them, how do you know what the adverse effect might be or won't be? and also with regards to the fact that what happens if you vaccinate a nation or a proportion of a nation, and they think, oh, okay, we're now immune. And then, we're seeing constantly virus mutations. If the virus mutates, they may think they're vaccinated, open up everything because they think everything's fine, and then actually find that the vaccination was of no value. And therefore you're back to square one again, potentially. Okay, there's an argument, should any of this ever happen? And I, with hindsight now, I think they took all the wrong measures on a personal level. But I wanted to talk about the fact, just to highlight to people, okay, here's a process. This is what happens, and why I think it's worth discussing is because I don't think, in regards to these studies so far and what's come out, that there's any degree of comfort. If you don't know the full effectiveness of antibodies, you don't know how long protection is going to last. You don't know what the benefits are to people over 55 who are deemed to be at risk. What is the benefit to this? And I'm struggling to see it, frankly.
Oh yeah, I completely agree, and great points, Paul, in regards to how the handling of it. And in my opinion, I think it's one of those things that I just want to verify that once this is completed and they introduce this into the public for use, is that I think the most important thing that we could do is just to ensure that that is an individual type decision. And my fear is that again, some of these states where they try to institute some of these forced program, and there's already lawsuits being filed in the United States in regards to universities that have began to try to impose those forced things. So I think, to me, it just comes down to a personal decision to do it, and I would never judge anyone who decided to or not to do it. So that's just my thoughts on it.
No, absolutely, it is a personal decision, and I agree that it should not be mandatory. I mean, the Russians have said it's not mandatory. That okay, they'd encourage people to have it done, but if people don't want to have the vaccine done, then that's fine. And I think that's a reasonable standpoint. We can, everyone has a different opinion on things. Some people will, have very strong opinions one way or the other, and that's perfectly fine. And you're absolutely right. But if you start forcing people to have vaccines and putting restrictions, and I know there's a lot of theories about that happening. Well, if they want to go down that route, they're going to just cause even more mayhem and problems. And we're seeing enough evidence now that and I came back to a point I found with regards to the Fed, and when people think, well, the Fed's taken advantage of a situation with regards to the coronavirus and it allowed them to pump trillions of dollars. And yes, they did pump trillions of dollars, but in January, prior to any of this, pandemic being known or coming, the outbreak starting, Powell made the statement quite clearly that the last thing they ever wanted to do was have to be put in a situation where they would be pumping enormous amounts of stimulus into the US economy. It was the absolute last thing they would want to do. And subsequently, they've had no choice but to do it. And yes, there's no doubt there are corporations who've benefited. I'm not saying it's benefited everyone, and it certainly hasn't. But it's not a policy decision that they wanted to make, and they were forced into having to make, because if they hadn't made it, the entire United States would have collapsed, as would have happened in the United Kingdom. It would have all collapsed equally. So it wasn't a question that it benefits them to do it. It doesn't. It absolutely destroys everything, as I've said many times before, they've tried to keep in place since 2008. So it's of no benefit to them to do it. And I went back and checked, and Powell did. I'm slightly paraphrasing. I can probably find the exact quote somewhere. But that's the gist, that they never wanted to do this. It was not the thing to do. And now subsequently they've had to do it. And the question is, can they ever stop doing it? And of course, the answer is no.
Correct. Paul, I tell you what, it's been a great conversation. We do want to follow this up. Well, I tell you what, let's just go ahead and start the conversation now. I think the reason why the United States became so angry or concerned about Russia's efforts was to see the fact that the Philippines and the president, Rodrigo Duterte, specifically state, well, I want it first here. We'll go through the clinical trials. I'll inject it in myself first before anyone else.
Well, yeah, and they've even asked, can you, China, Russia finance the vaccine in some way? I think also, I think I might be wrong. Maduro said the same thing,
Yes.
and
So
and
go ahead. Go ahead.
so yeah, no, this is just another indication where you know if people get a Russian vaccine, if nations 20, 30, I don't know, whatever number of nations have the Russian vaccine, it's got no Western influence whatsoever. There's nothing, there's no Western input into that in any way, shape, or form. And okay, people may have reservations and okay, if people want to believe that there's a plot to try and kill everyone with vaccines, okay, that's your choice. Fine. If you want to believe that, that's up to you. But ask yourself the question, do you really imagine that Putin would do that to the Russian people? And if you really believe Putin would do that, and I'm sorry to say you don't understand Putin and you don't understand Russia in any way, shape, or form, because there is absolutely no way he would ever risk doing that. Apart from the fact that it would be the end of his presidency and he would throw Russia into utter chaos, and never mind all the other implications. He's not going to do that to his own people, and he's not, they're on at the moment that he's on this, Russia and China are on a path to try and steer the world in a new direction. And do we really think they're going to go and anger and cause, huge problems in other nations by issuing vaccines? And because the apart from anything else, the PR disaster it would be for Russia. I mean, it would be like handing manna from heaven to the United States in doing that. Russia is never going to do that. Putin's never going to do that. Yes, I understand why people in the West would have concerns, but here's the thing. Big pharma in the West and other vested interests are looking at this going, well, Russia might clean up and they might have vaccines for whatever, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, we don't know people. They're seeing that all these cash register signs, not, sorry, it doesn't work anymore. We're not going to have this enormous revenue that we may have anticipated having. So, I mean, okay, some may argue that's a bit of a clinical view, but at the end of the day, that's why I think in part there is concern about the Russian vaccine. And of course, there's all the propaganda, but I don't see why Russia would do it. I grant you it seems inordinately quick for them to do it. But I did say quite some time ago that Russia would be the first nation that would produce a vaccine, and I was convinced simply on the basis that their capabilities in the medical profession and is a lot more advanced again than Western nations realise. And I, not personally, but I know people who have had health issues have gone to Russia and had treatment and recovered from it with no Western medicine was able to help them. So. Okay, that's just an aside, and I'm not suggesting everyone goes to Russia to be treated, but my point is that yeah, I agree there needs to be. I mean, on the subject of vaccines, the only point I will make, I agree there needs to be an understanding. There needs to be a better understanding to what extent are the risks, what do those risks pose. That we've talked before about the link between autism and vaccines, and I'm not going to get into that subject because we're going to finish shortly anyway. But my point is, if we want to have a robust discussion about the risk of vaccines and whatever they may be, and how do we quantify that? How do we actually have mature discussions? Again, I just don't think it's helpful to suggest that intentionally there is a move in the world to commit mass genocide in some capacity or other on people through vaccines. That just completely destroys any mature discourse on the matter. And it's rather like 5G. I understand why people have concerns, and it's perfectly reasonable. But if we're going to link that to the coronavirus, it just destroys all the arguments. And if you try to have those discussions with people, they'll immediately go, oh, I suppose you believe this. And it just shuts off all avenues of discourse that might actually be able to affect some positive change. So, yeah. And there are people out there, and we know, who are trying to make, positive changes and raise very legitimate concerns about vaccines. I mean, look, from my personal point of view, I don't see there is any material benefit for me to have a vaccine. I think at the end of the day, if I got the virus, I probably would be, I may be asymptomatic, but I don't think I'm going to have. I may not be, but don't feel I'm going to have serious health issues as a result of it. I mean, okay, tempt fate, because anything can happen to anybody. But my rationale is I don't see any benefit to having vaccine. But what I would say is, if I went to certain places in Africa, I would most certainly have certain vaccines, because I wouldn't want to come back in a body bag, because the risk of not having vaccines in certain places could be, and okay, that may seem extreme, but I take the view that you have to, we do over vaccinate in Western nations. I don't doubt that, and that is a concern. But I work on the basis of what is the most sensible decision, and for me, I don't think it's a sensible decision. And that's a personal decision to have a vaccine with regards to the coronavirus.
Yeah, correct. Very well said, Paul. Paul, I want to thank you for a great discussion today, and for our Gadfly subscribers, thank you once again for supporting our multi-channel network. We sincerely appreciate that. And for those, again, tuning in for the very first time, jump over. You can get a 30-day free trial of the Gadfly multi-channel network, and then you can do either the $10 a month or save a little money for the $100 a year. So, Paul, thank you for a great discussion today, and we'll do this again soon.
Yes, and a pleasure as ever. And thank you to everyone who subscribes to and all your support. We greatly appreciate it.